Hello everyone, welcome to this week's 3D design activity, brought to you by the Corona Public Library's Maker Exchange. My name is Mr. Martin, and this week we're showing you how to make a multi-tool that fits inside of your wallet. Without further ado, let's get started. As always, fire up your favorite browser and head to TinkerCad.com. Once you're signed in, just go ahead and click on Create a New Design to load the workplane. Now, as a quick reminder, the left mouse button selects objects, the middle mouse button lets us move the workplane, and the right mouse button lets us move the camera. We'll set the snap grid to 0.25 millimeters, and we'll go over to the basic shapes and insert a box. Now, the credit card that I measured in my wallet was about 80 by 5.5, or 8 centimeters by 5.5 centimeters, or in this case, in millimeters, we would just multiply by 10. You'll note here if I put 8.5 and 5.5, it's too small because we do have to convert. So we'll get this to be just about the right size, and mine was actually about 54 millimeters. And we'll move it over to make it easier to work with. Once again, you can use the keyboard keys to line it up perfectly on the grid. Since we're creating tools here, exact measurements will be required. And you'll notice every time you press on the keyboard key, it moves it over by 0.25 millimeters, since that is our snap grid we're working with. So if you needed more accurate measurements, you could always just move the snap grid. So let's make this a little thin. We'll go with 6 millimeters. That's, I would say, about 2 or 3 layers of print material here. We can always change that layer. And we're set. The first tool that we'll insert here is actually one of my personal favorites. We're going to insert essentially a wrench to the middle of our tool. So we're going to choose a hexagon here, and we're going to place it right around the middle. Now you do want it to be the same on both sides, or pretty much even or symmetrical. So we're going to change that to 20. And that's just for now. We will get into exact measurements in a bit. You do want to make sure that it goes through your object, as with many other holes that we have created in TinkerCad. And so I looked it up. Common hex nut diameters start at around 10 millimeters, and they go up by about 2 or 3 with each size. So once we have it situated right around the middle, we can simply copy using Control-C and then paste using Control-V. So we're going to up this by about 3 millimeters, and we're going to do the same thing. Now we're going to copy this one. And if you're on Mac, you can always press Command-C or Command-V. So the next size up is around 17 millimeters. And copying that once again. Now notice here I copied without clicking away from it, which will actually bring up issues when you're trying to change the exact measurements. So it's a good idea just to click away and then click back. So here the next size up is 19. And finally we'll go with 22. And again, these are in millimeter diameters. So now that we've got our wrenches essentially here in the middle, we just have to line them up, and then we will be set. To do so, you might want to just move it over and place it within the other ones, but notice we completely cover up the smaller hex nut here. And that's not what we want. We want to line it up along this a single edge, which will let us essentially make one giant, almost like a key piece, to unlock all of these hex nuts. So instead, we are just going to line it up with one of the edges that's mostly done for us already. Reminder that you can use the keyboard arrows to nudge objects one direction or the other. And I'll do that here for every single one, just to make sure that they are lined up along the same edge. Now when I do that, and the reason I did that is so now I can have one consistent hole where I can then fit the hex nut that I'm trying to open inside of my tool. And I can simply slide it up or down depending on which one I want to unlock or twist open. So here we have our hexagons, but they are solid objects. So we need to select each one. You can do so by holding Shift and clicking on them. Select the hole option, drag it down through our object, select our main credit card shape here, and then simply cut it out by grouping them together. And there you go, you have your first tool complete, and all you'd have to do now is insert that over and twist. The next tool that we will add is a box cutter or a box opener. So we will pick a wedge here. We're going to rotate this 180 degrees. And now we're going to rotate once more 90 degrees and move it over to one of the corners. Now, before I do anything else, with the wedge selected, I'm going to choose the hole option, and you'll notice a gray shadow that comes out on my main object, and you can drag the wedge down to grow that shadow. So when we group them, you'll notice it creates this nice little wedge cutout, almost like a bottle opener here. But we can get creative with this. You can grow the shadow to essentially expand the wedge that we're creating. And now you want to make sure that it's lined up approximately with the corner here. And there's a reason for that. So you can rotate it, and we're actually going to do that to create a nice sharp, kind of a pointy bit here. But you'll notice you want the shadow to completely overtake the corner. You don't want to leave any material behind there, and you'll see why once we cut it. So here, I'm satisfied with the shape. I'm going to grow it a little bit more, and you'll notice there is a little tiny piece of the corner still there. So when I group these objects, it's not quite an exact pointed corner. Now, depending on your 3D printer's capabilities, you will eventually, most likely, have to sand this down in order to create a perfectly sharp edge. No 3D printer can really achieve that level of sharpness that we're creating, but nonetheless we can design it to be so and always adjust after the print using sandpaper. So there we go. We've created our nice little box opener here, helpful for opening all of the packages that you have delivered at home. And lastly, the other main tool that I use a lot is a screwdriver. So we're going to insert a box here, and the first step is actually to cut a huge straight chunk out of that edge on that side. Now, oops, here I accidentally made it way too small. We want to make sure it covers the entire edge, so there we go. And once we move it over, we got to make sure it fits on the camera, so we'll shrink it down just a bit and line it up with the edge. Now, we want to leave enough of a piece to be able to work with. We don't want it to be too thin or too wide, because that will affect its structural integrity. If it's too thin, then it won't actually be able to turn any screws, but if it's too wide, it won't fit any screws. So here I just kind of play it by ear, or by eye here. Select the hole tool, select both and group them, and there we go. Now we have a solid piece to create a screwdriver with. And the way we can do that is actually twofold. We do have quite a few shapes at our disposal, but the simplest one that we can use is the wedge that we've already used and worked with. Now, if you ever needed specific shapes or specific kind of screwdriver ends, you can always add those in yourself. But here, a nice flathead screwdriver is a very simple one for us to create. So same as before, we're going to rotate this until we get the angle that we need. So once again, 180 degrees that way. There's probably a shorter way, but this is the way that I find easiest. And we're going to move it over. Once again, make sure to choose the hole option for this object, since we are going to be essentially cutting that shape out of the main one. And you'll notice when we bring it down, you want to avoid cutting into any of the main body of the multi-tool here. You want to make sure you're only cutting the edge. And you can always rotate it to achieve that if necessary. So here I actually copied and pasted a second one, and you might be thinking the same thing. Well, if I simply cut out the top and the bottom here, I'll have a nice pointed edge that will be symmetrical and everything will be fine and dandy. But you'll notice that when we adjust this, we have material that hangs over. And if you remember one of our main 3D printing tips, you want to try to avoid that whenever possible. It is possible for some 3D printers to print supports for those overhanging objects or overhanging material, but it's also much easier to simply print from the ground up. So here you'll notice if I were to cut this out, I'd have a huge chunk now that's kind of floating in midair, and you want to avoid that whenever possible. So instead, what I'm going to do here is simply delete the bottom object, or the bottom wedge, and I'm going to create one flat surface and one slanted surface. So I'm going to rotate this back to normal. Oops, it got away from me there. And again, if you need to change camera angles, always do so. It makes things much easier to work with. So here you'll notice my strategy. I want to make one flat edge that already exists and one slanted edge for my screwdriver. And unlike the box cutter tool, or the box opener tool, I actually do want to leave a little bit of a lip on this one. I don't want it to be a perfectly sharp edge. I do actually want some width there in order to be able to act as an actual screwdriver. So here I manually change the angle, and I think it actually looks pretty good here. So we're going to group both of them, and there you go. You have a nice little screwdriver edge that you can use. And now, friends, is the part where I will challenge you to customize it, to think of tools that you use on a daily basis, and add those in. One common one that I see on these types of objects is a ruler. So here we're going to make little wedges that are around 2 millimeters thick, and I'm simply going to copy and paste all of these. And you'll notice my grid here is perfectly lined up, and each big solid square that you see on the grid is 1 centimeter. So here I can simply line this up. Remember, you can use the keyboard arrows to perfectly line it up according to your snap grid. And we'll make sure that the bottom edge here, or the right edge, is the actual mark. So moving the camera over, going to make sure that these are all lined up. And there we have it. Now I do have it sticking up and out of the object by about 2 millimeters. You can always adjust this depending on what you prefer. Technically, an 8 millimeter thick object isn't really going to fit in your wallet, but you can always adjust the thickness of the entire tool here by simply scaling it down. So this is just to make it obvious that we are making a ruler here. And you'll notice one by one, I changed the height. I could have simply copied and pasted the first one, but decided to do each one individually. And I do notice that some of them don't seem to be lined up, so I will do that now. There we go. Looks like they're mostly good. This one still looks a little weird, but I think it's just the camera angle. And let's get the last one in place here. And you can even get more accurate if you'd like. You can do every ½ centimeter. You can even do every millimeter, although that might be a little tricky to do when you actually print it. Some 3D printers have trouble getting that kind of accuracy. So boom, there you go. You have a ruler on one side. And one other thing that you might be interested in that you do see commonly on these tools, especially ones that are made of metal, is a saw or some kind of cutting tool. Now again, you won't be able to achieve any real kind of sharpness with a 3D printer. You do eventually have to either sand down the edge or modify it yourself in some way in order to get, true sharpness. But if you've ever wanted to cut cardboard or styrofoam, you can simply do it using this method and with this tool. So if you hold Shift, you can scale this wedge. And I'm not doing any I'm not doing any exact measurements here. I just want to show you guys how to create the general shape. So I'm going to rotate this over. Can I get a feel for what you want this edge to look like? Just simply copy paste a bunch of them. And now it looks more like a saw. So again, as with most other things we've done here, select them all, use the hole option, and cut out that shape. Do make sure it goes through the whole thing too. Oops, and I accidentally merged them as opposed to cutting out. So I'm going to do it again. Remember, Control-Z does undo what you just did, letting you redo properly. And one last thing, as we did with the box opener, we can simply use the wedge to create an angle to give it some true or some approximate sharpness here. And note that I'm able to make all of these complex tools with pretty much the same process just over and over again. And a lot of 3D design is that way. So here, simply make sure that it is as thin or as thick as you'd like it. Group them and cut it out. So there you go. You have a bit of a saw tool there. You obviously want to go and clean up the edges, but for now, there is your multi-tool, my friends. As always, thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this content, stick around for more, and we'll see you in the next video.